This is Dr. David Shine, and welcome to Business Law 101.
So about the same time, especially, even though we know that the Russian Revolution took place in 1917, I assume all of you on this call know some of your basic history, that one of the things that's pretty interesting about it was that the communism did not really get evaluated in the United States. Most of the people in the United States just regarded, oh, this is some weird thing that's happening in Russia. And what happened, though, is during the Great Depression, which again happened when the stock market crashed, usually we date that to the stock market crash in 1929. So during the 1930s, there was a very strong interest in communism as a way of fixing our broken society during the Great Depression. And also people kept reflecting on the horrors of World War I when many people, died due to the war and due to hunger and caused by the war and things like that. So it's a pretty interesting debate. Some very famous people were members, at least briefly, of the Communist Party. The one that may surprise you most is Ronald Reagan, who became the conservative president in 1980 to 1988. But he actually briefly belonged to the Communist Party in the 1930s. Yes, he was that old, folks, by 1930s, and lived to be fairly old. And then, of course, we progressed past that, past World War II, and then as the businesses just boomed in the United States following World War II, because remember, other than Pearl Harbor, the United States had largely not been super damaged by World War II, and we had built this massive production ability, and it was converted from wartime production of planes and tanks and so forth to making cars and other stuff, and making, eventually rockets to the moon and things like that. So not unexpectedly, as we got past that point, we got into the growth of consumerism in the 1960s. And John F. Kennedy, in his short time in office, came out with the Consumers' Bill of Rights in the early 60s. And then perhaps one of the most significant impacts on business, believe it or not, was at least on a major industry, our automotive industry in the United States, was Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed. And if any of you are interested in automobiles and the movement towards having safer cars, it's a very interesting book, just to see not necessarily the book itself, but the impact that book had, because safety was really not a major consideration. To give you an idea, seat belts were barely invented when that book was released. And cars did not automatically come with seat belts. And I don't recall exactly what year they did, but it was after 1967. And then the dashboards of cars, unless you bought an expensive car like a Cadillac or luxury car, the dashboard was hard metal, which meant in a front-end collision, imagine you have no seatbelt on, the car stops suddenly, your face smashes into the hard dashboard, the hard metal dashboard. It's pretty ugly deal. And then the other very significant thing at that time period was the steering column. And the steering column was fixed hard, which meant that if you were in a front-end collision, that the steering column became a spear that could crush or penetrate the chest of the driver. So there were a lot of very specific things that are pointed out. Although the best known part is there's video supporting Ralph Nader's studies, is they took a Chevrolet Corvair, and some of you may have gone to car shows. There's a few restored Corvairs running around Houston. I don't know if there's one. I had a friend who had a beautiful Corvair convertible. But anyway, the Corvairs came out in the late 60s to compete with the Volkswagen. And most of you know that the Volkswagen has actually stopped producing the famous Volkswagen Bug. But in any event, during the early 1960s, Volkswagen Bug began to be sold in the United States and became a phenomenon. And it was partially because they were so super cheap, and they were cheap to operate. They got good gas mileage with their little bitty rear air-cooled engines. What was interesting is the Chevrolet had a lot of, the Corvair had a lot of interesting features. But in any event, one of the things was if you played with the car enough, you could roll the car over. And so Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed went after the several issues I just mentioned, but specifically went after the Corvair. And his book showed, Corvairs rolling over and all that stuff. And the most interesting part to me, as a little bit of a car buff from that time period, was that the Volkswagen Bug was much, much easier to roll over than the Corvair. And if you look at a Volkswagen Bug, the profile of the current, or the last Bugs, there's still a good handful running around out there. But if you see one of the original Bugs, the roof is taller and the car is narrower. So if you can imagine that, if you tipped it, it could very easily tip over. In fact, I had one of my best friends from high school, when he was in college, rolled his Volkswagen Bug. And fortunately, he wasn't killed. And he and his buddies got out of the car, rolled it back over, and continued to drive it. Now, it was a mess, but he was still able to drive it to the next city along the highway, or wherever he was here in Texas. But it is very interesting. So I think that helped to highlight the fact that industry at that time was not concerned about consumers, was not concerned about consumer safety. So Nader does get credit for helping to do things. And of course, since that time, the federal government has continued to mandate different safety improvements in vehicles. And we talked about Rawls' theory of justice already. And like I said, it's not something I need to revisit now.
This is Dr. David D. Shine for Business Law 101. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favorite platform.